Discussion on aliasing and Nyquist limit in Doppler echocardiography. Aliasing is a phenomenon in pulsed Doppler echocardiography in which, when the velocity is beyond a particular limit known as the Nyquist limit, the direction of flow is depicted as opposite to that of the actual one. Nyquist limit is half the pulse repetition frequency of the ultrasound signal emitted by the Doppler transducer. Aliasing does not occur in continuous wave Doppler as the transmission of Doppler beam is continuous and not in pulses. High pulse repetition frequency Doppler recording showing aortic regurgitation jet above the baseline with a cutoff at the upper end and a wraparound seen below the baseline. Here aliasing is seen because the limit has been set just above 200 cm per second while the velocity of the jet is higher than that. The tracing can be depicted upwards to its full extent by adjusting the velocity limit or by adjusting the baseline downwards. The dense jet seen below the baseline is the forward aortic flow. The peak forward gradient is measured as 20 mm of mercury, which does not indicate significant aortic stenosis. This is a diagrammatic representation of what happens when the baseline of the Doppler tracing is shifted downwards. The portion of the AR jet which was below the baseline gets shifted to the cutoff portion of the AR jet above the baseline. Similar change occurs if maximum velocity setting is changed as well. Increasing the velocity setting increases the pulse repetition frequency of the HPRF. Similar phenomenon can be seen in color Doppler echocardiography as well. When the Nyquist limit is exceeded, a flow which should have been depicted as blue, that is away from the transducer, is depicted as red, seemingly as towards the transducer. This is the first wraparound. Nyquist limit of the color Doppler is displayed at the upper and lower ends of the color bar, which may be displayed either on the right upper corner or left upper corner. Here the flow away from the transducer in blue color has a Nyquist limit of -77 cm per second. Nyquist limit for the flow towards the transducer is not seen in this image as it has been cropped below that level. When the Nyquist limit is exceeded twice, the color again shifts back to the original color. This is known as second wraparound. In this image, the color bar is displayed on the left upper corner. Obviously, this is from a different machine. Both flow away from the transducer and towards the transducer has a Nyquist limit of 75 cm per second. Nyquist limits are different for color Doppler and HPRF Doppler even during a single imaging session. In the image shown here, Nyquist limit for HPRF is about 5 meter per second in both directions, so that aortic regurgitation jet with peak velocity of 4.42 meter per second is seen to its full extent above the baseline. In the same image, the Nyquist limit of the color Doppler is only 63 centimeters per second. Hence, the color AR jet is seen as a mosaic jet in the inset. Multiple colors represent the variance in the velocity in each region due to the turbulence of the jet. Change in color with variance in the velocity is displayed in the color bar on the top right corner. The color bar is not just red and blue, but a continuum of colors for varying velocities. Aliasing may not be displayed if the jet is not seen fully, as in this case with trivial aortic regurgitation. Here the velocity limit above the baseline is about 3 meter per second. That would correspond to a gradient of 36 millimeters of mercury, which is not what is expected for a usual AR jet. In the previous image, AR jet velocity was 4.42 meter per second, which corresponded to a gradient of 78.14 millimeters of mercury. Aliasing velocity and Nyquist limit will be much lower in case of pulsed Doppler. That is why only HPRF is used for high velocity jets. Discussion on athlete's heart. Athlete's heart denotes structural, functional and electrical remodeling seen in trained athletes. It is a physiological adaptation helping athletes perform physical tasks better than non-athletes. Though most of the findings in athletes' heart are related to the left ventricle, changes do occur in the right ventricle as well. During aerobic exercise, which is isotonic, the heart rate and stroke volume increases. Systemic vascular resistance falls, but slight to moderate increase in blood pressure can occur due to the increased cardiac output. As the cardiac output increases, it is mostly a volume overload situation and left ventricle can develop eccentric hypertrophy with enlargement of cavity and proportionate increase in wall thickness. Isometric exercise or weight training, on the other hand, causes only slight increase in cardiac output due to increase in heart rate, but there is significant rise in blood pressure leading to pressure overload of the left ventricle. This causes concentric left ventricular hypertrophy in which increase in wall thickness predominates without much increase in cavity size. These cardiac adaptations tend to normalize left ventricular wall stress. A study evaluating 947 elite, highly trained athletes has reported echocardiographic left ventricular dimensions. Highest left ventricular wall thickness noted was 16 millimeters. Wall thickness of 13 millimeter or more were noted in only 16 of the 947 athletes. All these persons had increased left ventricular end diastolic dimensions ranging from 55 to 63 millimeters. The hypertrophy was noted only in rowers, canoeists, and cyclists. Enlargement of left ventricular cavity, increased wall thickness, and increased trabeculations in athlete's heart will have to be differentiated from conditions like dilated cardiomyopathy, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, and isolated left ventricular non-compaction. Effect of exercise on right ventricle. Due to limitations of echocardiogram in evaluating the right ventricle, magnetic resonance imaging study of the right ventricle along with that of the left ventricle has been reported. 21 male endurance athletes were compared with untrained control subjects. Similar changes in left and right ventricular mass, volume and function were noted in endurance athletes. Authors concluded that athlete's heart is a balanced enlarged heart. ECG and imaging changes noted in endurance athletes may overlap with findings in arrhythmogenic right ventricular cardiomyopathy. ECG changes in athlete's heart. Athlete's bradycardia due to increased parasympathetic tone and decreased sympathetic tone is a well-known observation. Though sinus bradycardia is usual, other abnormalities like sinus arrhythmia, sinus arrest, wandering atrial pacemaker, and coronary sinus rhythm have been described. First degree and second degree morbid type 1 atrioventricular block may be seen occasionally. Increase in QRS voltages satisfying criteria for left or right ventricular hypertrophy can be present. J-point elevation and early repolarization pattern has also been reported. Biphasic T waves and T wave inversions can occur in athlete's heart syndrome. Most of the ECG changes due to increased parasympathetic tone disappear on exercise ECG, usually indicating their benign nature. In a study of 1005 athletes, 14% had distinctly abnormal ECG pattern, 26% had mildly abnormal pattern, and 60% had normal or minor alterations in ECG. Structural cardiac abnormalities were identified in 5% of athletes in this study. Larger LV end diastolic dimensions and wall thickness were associated with abnormalities in ECG. ECG abnormalities were associated with endurance sports like cycling, rowing or canoeing, and cross-country skiing. Study had 75% males and abnormal ECGs were associated with male gender and age below 20 years. A curious finding was that 5% of athletes had significantly abnormal or bizarre ECG patterns without evidence of structural cardiovascular abnormalities or increase in cardiac dimensions. A multimodality imaging approach to differentiate physiological changes due to athlete's heart from significant cardiac ailment has been suggested by an expert consensus from the European Association of Cardiovascular Imaging. ECG, echocardiography, and cardiac magnetic resonance imaging with late gadolinium enhancing are important investigative modalities to be used. These are useful in suspected myocardial diseases like cardiomyopathy and myocarditis. When there is a suspicion of coronary artery disease, exercise ECG and exercise stress echocardiography have been suggested. Nuclear cardiology imaging, cardiac computed tomography, and CMR may be needed in selected cases. As there is radiation exposure, considering the young age of most athletes, use of cardiac CT and nuclear cardiology imaging should be limited to athletes with unclear stress echocardiography or CMR. Discussion on cardiac implantable electronic devices or CIED as seen on chest X-ray. Cardiac pacemakers were the earliest cardiac implantable electronic devices to be used ever since the first implant in 1958. This image shows a single chamber pacemaker with pulse generator and lead, two electrodes for stimulation, a proximal ring electrode and a distal tip electrode are seen towards the apex of the right ventricle. The pulse generator is seen in the right pectoral region. The lead is coursing through the right subclavian vein into the superior vena cava. From superior vena cava, it reaches the right ventricle through the right atrium. A Starr Edwards prosthetic aortic valve with 3 struts and a sewing ring is also seen within the cardiac shadow. Chest X-ray showing a single chamber pacemaker with a screw-in lead kept on the septal aspect of the right ventricle. Septal pacing on the right ventricular outflow region may give a narrower QRS complex with better left ventricular synchrony. A narrower QRS reduces the long-term chance of left ventricular dysfunction, which is a downside of right ventricular apical pacing. It may be noted that lead tip is located higher than in the previous case. This image shows a dual chamber pacemaker with a right atrial lead and a right ventricular lead. In this case, the pacemaker pulse generator was implanted in the left pectoral region. The leads traverse the left subclavian vein and left brachiocephalic vein to reach the superior vena cava. The atrial lead is a J-shaped lead and tip is usually located in the right atrial appendage. The right ventricular lead was placed at the right ventricular apex. Chest X-ray showing implantable cardioverter defibrillator with 2 high voltage electrode coils and 2 pacing electrodes. ICD is an implantable device which can treat both brady and tachyarrhythmias. If it detects significant bradycardia, it gives backup pacing signals. If a ventricular tachycardia is detected, it tries initially to suppress it by overdrive pacing. If it does not succeed, a direct current internal shock is delivered across the high voltage coils to terminate the arrhythmia. If a very fast ventricular tachycardia, which is life-threatening, or a ventricular fibrillation is detected, the device straightaway gives a direct current shock to terminate the arrhythmia. One high voltage coil is in the superior vena cava, while another one is seen in the right ventricle. 2 pacing electrodes are seen beyond the high voltage coil in the right ventricle. This is a single chamber ICD. A dual chamber ICD will have an additional atrial lead which is useful in sensing atrial arrhythmias and avoiding inappropriate shocks. Inappropriate shocks are an important disadvantage of the ICD. Cardiac resynchronization therapy is an advanced form of three-chamber pacing which is used to synchronize left ventricular contraction in heart failure. Hence, they are also known as heart failure devices. An ICD can be included in the device, then it will be called CRT-D, while the plain CRT will be called CRT-P. CRT-D will have additional high voltage defibrillator coils. CRT-P device is seen in this image with one atrial lead and one lead each in the right ventricle and a coronary vein. Electrode in the coronary vein paces the left ventricle epicardially. Since it is a CRT-P, no high voltage leads are present. CRT-D device will be larger as it requires a larger battery for delivering defibrillator shocks. Two high voltage coils will be seen in CRT-D, one placed in the superior vena cava and another in the right ventricle. CRT-D is also called a combo device as it is a combination of CRT and ICD. This is a fluoroscopic view of three leads of a CRT-P. It shows an atrial lead, a right ventricular lead, and a left ventricular lead in the coronary vein. Lead details are seen well on fluoroscopy. Screw-in coil at the tip of the right ventricular electrode is quite evident. Part of the CRT device is seen in the left upper corner of the image along with redundant lead coils. Discussion on dilated cardiomyopathy. In Modge's classification of cardiomyopathies, M suffix D stands for dilated cardiomyopathy. Cardiomyopathy is a primary disorder of the heart muscle which causes abnormal myocardial performance. Dilated cardiomyopathy is characterized by progressive left ventricular dilatation and systolic dysfunction. Pathologically, there is increase in the size and weight of the heart. There is ventricular dilatation with near normal wall thickness. The myocardial systolic dysfunction is out of proportion to the fibrosis. The incidence of dilated cardiomyopathy varies among different studies. One study has quoted annual incidence of 6 cases per 100,000 population. Death from progressive pump failure occurs at the rate of around 25% in first year, 35 to 40% in 2 years, and up to 40 to 80% over 5 years. Stabilization may occur in about 20% of cases, but complete recovery is rare in idiopathic dilated cardiomyopathy. Familial dilated cardiomyopathy constitutes 20 to 35% of idiopathic dilated cardiomyopathy. Inheritance patterns may vary from autosomal dominant recessive to X-linked and mitochondrial inheritance patterns. In some families, there may be associated conduction system disease of varying severity. Mutations have been described in titin, lamin AC, and sodium channel in familial DCM. Lamin AC and sodium channel mutations may be associated with cardiac conduction abnormalities. Cardiomegaly on chest X-ray in dilated cardiomyopathy. The cardiothoracic ratio is increased and the right border is shifted to the right, indicating right atrial enlargement. Superior vena cava shadow is seen upwards from the right atrial contour, indicating congested superior vena cava. Sick persons may present with features of frank pulmonary edema in the form of Hilar-Hayes or bat-wing pattern. Significant left ventricular dysfunction can exist without much cardiomegaly on chest X-ray as well. ECG may show sinus tachycardia, left atrial overload, and sometimes left ventricular hypertrophy. A wide QRS complex with left bundle branch block pattern may indicate potential benefit from cardiac resynchronization therapy. ECG is more useful in suggesting diseases which have to be considered in the differential diagnosis, like coronary artery disease and severe aortic stenosis. Severe aortic stenosis with heart failure may not have an audible murmur due to the low output state. Holter monitoring is useful in identifying ventricular arrhythmias which will alter the prognosis, especially sustained ventricular tachycardia. Holter monitoring is indicated in those with history of palpitation, syncope and near syncope. Echocardiogram is the mainstay for the diagnosis of dilated cardiomyopathy and exclusion of other conditions. Though global hypokinesia of the left ventricle is the hallmark of dilated cardiomyopathy, Some regional wall motion abnormalities may not negate the diagnosis of dilated cardiomyopathy. M-mode echocardiogram showing severe left ventricular dysfunction. A prominent B hum is seen in the mitral valve echocardiogram, indicating high left ventricular end diastolic pressure. E-point septal separation or EPSS is also increased. Calcium scoring is useful to differentiate ischemic dilated cardiomyopathy from idiopathic variety. If the calcium score is negative, it is unlikely to be of ischemic origin. As no contrast injection is involved, it does not pose any risk of decompensation. Coronary angiography is considered in those with age above 40 years and a history suggestive of coronary artery disease, or having a high coronary risk profile or an abnormal ECG. In the management of dilated cardiomyopathy, limitation of physical activity based on functional status is recommended. Salt and fluid restriction is needed in those with systemic or pulmonary congestion. Medical therapy consists of angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors, diuretics, digoxin, and carvedilol. Recent addition to this group are ARNI and SGLT2 inhibitors. Hydroxyl nitrate combination can be used as a vasodilator when ACE inhibitors are not tolerated or in the presence of renal dysfunction. Another alternative is angiotensin receptor blocker when the renal function is good. Anticoagulation is considered if the ejection fraction is less than 30% when there is a history of thromboembolism and in the presence of mural thrombi. A thrombus in dilated cardiomyopathy has a higher chance of embolization than in coronary artery disease. In coronary artery disease, the thrombus is kept away from the bloodstream by a segment of myocardium which is poorly contracting, while the rest of the myocardium contracts well. In dilated cardiomyopathy, since the hypokinesia is global, the thrombus is within the region of the blood flow and has a higher chance of breaking off and embolization. Dopamine, dobutamine, and phosphodiesterase inhibitors like amrinone and milrinone may be used to tide over a crisis in acute decompensated heart failure with dilated cardiomyopathy. Cardiac resynchronization therapy is useful in those with dyssynchrony, as evidenced by wide QRS complex and left bundle branch block pattern on ECG. Implantable cardioverter defibrillator is useful to manage life-threatening ventricular arrhythmias. Cardiac transplantation is of course the last option for refractory heart failure in dilated cardiomyopathy. Ebstein's anomaly is one of the cyanotic congenital heart diseases in which natural survival to adulthood is not uncommon. Echo picture demonstrates the gross distal displacement of the septal tricuspid leaflet and the atrialized portion of right ventricle marked as ARV. A portion of the right ventricle is atrialized due to distal displacement of the septal and posterior leaflets of the tricuspid valve. The anterior tricuspid leaflet is large and sail-like. It produces a loud tricuspid component of first heart sound while closing, which is called the sail sound. About half of the patients with Ebstein's anomaly can have atrial septal defect or patent foramen ovale. In Ebstein's anomaly, the right to left shunting is not due to pulmonary hypertension, but because the tricuspid regurgitation jet is directed across the atrial septal defect. Almost half of the patients with Ebstein's anomaly have evidence of a right-sided accessory pathway with a WPW syndrome. This can be associated with atrioventricular reentrant tachycardias as well. Right atrial overload with tall Himalayan P waves and polyphasic or splintered QRS complexes are the other ECG hallmarks of Ebstein's anomaly. The age of presentation in Ebstein's anomaly may vary from childhood to adulthood depending on factors like the severity of tricuspid regurgitation, associated abnormalities like atrial septal defect, and the pulmonary vascular resistance in the newborn. Auscultatory hallmarks of Ebstein's anomaly are multiple heart sounds, loud T1 or sail sound, and a scratchy superficial diastolic murmur due to tricuspid stenosis. In the adult, a striking feature is often the huge enlargement of the cardiac silhouette, contributed mainly by the large right atrium and the atrialized portion of the right ventricle. This X-ray from a person with Epstein's anomaly shows cardiomegaly which is not so huge and right atrial enlargement. Cardiomegaly with relative oligemi of the lung fields and reduced cardiac motion can produce a stenciled out appearance in Epstein's anomaly. The large right atrium and an association of right-sided axillary pathways make Epstein's anomaly prone for supraventricular tachycardias. Localization and ablation of axillary pathways in Epstein's anomaly is difficult due to the large right atrium and distorted anatomy. The atrialized portion of right ventricle will show ventricular electrograms and an atrial pressure tracing. This is known as Hernandez sign. Hernandez sign is elicited using a catheter which can record electrogram as well as measure the pressure, known as sucker catheter. Epstein's type of anomaly of the left atrioventricular wall is seen in levotransposition of great arteries, known also as congenitally corrected transposition, LTGA and CTGA. Epstein's anomaly has been associated with maternal intake of lithium during pregnancy. MOD echo in Epstein's anomaly shows the delay between the mitral and tricuspid valve closures. Both valves are imaged in the same parasternal view in Epstein's anomaly. The distal displacement of the septal tricuspid leaflet is the characteristic echocardiographic finding in Epstein's anomaly, noted in apical four-chamber view. Surgical repair is by Da Silva's cone procedure, which constructs a funnel-like valve using the native valve leaflets. This avoids the problems associated with artificial valves, including bioprosthetic valves, especially in children. Here are a few journal references on Epstein's anomaly. In one study, cone procedure group had 85% reduction in tricuspid regurgitation compared to 56% in the conventional group at discharge from hospital. The cone procedure involves detachment of tricuspid leaflets, division of chordae, plication of the tricuspid annulus, rotation of leaflets, and final reinsertion of the leaflets in the modified tricuspid valve annulus. Since cone procedure has become an effective hemodynamic intervention for Epstein's anomaly, late mortality due to arrhythmias assume more importance. Periprocedural electrophysiological study and ablation of potential arrhythmic circuits have been suggested as a preventive strategy. This aggressive protocol documented significant electrophysiological findings in 69%, including 8 patients in whom there was no prior suspicion of arrhythmia. 17 of these patients underwent catheter ablation, while the remainder had intraoperative interventions. The strategy could prevent sudden death in those treated with this protocol. Real-time intraoperative 3D transesophageal echocardiographic guidance for cone procedure has been used successfully, as in case of mitral valve repair. Here are a couple of important references, including the original publication from Da Silva. Few more salient references for the topic. ECG in Epstein's anomaly of tricuspid valve showing right axis deviation of QRS, North star waves in 2, 3 and AVF and V1 suggesting fragmented QRS. Peaked P waves indicate a right atrial abnormality, though the typical voltage criteria for right atrial enlargement of more than 0.25 mV is not satisfied. Fragmented QRS occurs in Epstein's anomaly due to abnormal conduction in the atrialized right ventricle. A portion of the right ventricle is atrialized because of distal displacement of the septal and posterior leaflets of tricuspid valve. They are also prone for atrial arrhythmias due to dilated right atrium. There is a risk of stroke because of potential paradoxical embolism due to intermittent right to left shunting across a patent foramen ovale. Earlier, the descriptions for the QRS abnormality in Epstein's anomaly were splintered QRS, fractionated QRS, or second QRS. Intracardiac mapping has demonstrated late depolarization during this period. Fragmented QRS is associated with a higher arrhythmic risk and a larger atrialized right ventricular area. They also had more severe tricuspid regurgitation. The extent of fragmented QRS is measured by the number of leads showing the FQRS. QRS duration is longer in those with FQRS. Those with increased QRS duration have a higher mortality on long-term follow-up after corrective surgery. Wolff-Parkinson-White syndrome can be associated with Epstein's anomaly due to accessory atrioventricular bypass tracts. They can present with reentrant supraventricular tachycardia. First set of references on ECG in Epstein's anomaly of tricuspid valve. Second set of references on ECG in Epstein's anomaly of tricuspid valve. ECG in Epstein's anomaly of tricuspid valve showing right bundle branch block pattern with polyphasic and splintered QRS. The QRS is wide and lead V2 shows RS pattern mimicking right bundle branch block. Lead 2 shows multiple small deflections, that is splintered QRS. Slurred S wave in lateral leads also form part of the RBBB pattern. The duration of QRS has been linked to right ventricular enlargement and dysfunction in Epstein's anomaly. A larger atrialized right ventricular volume has been noted in these cases. As a corollary, those with near normal ECG would have mild morphological abnormalities and a better clinical profile. Splintered and polyphasic QRS of Epstein's anomaly can also be considered as fragmented QRS as per the new terminology. Fragmented QRS is a marker of myocardial scar and consequent arrhythmias in ischemic and non-ischemic cardiomyopathy. Similarly, fragmented QRS has been shown to be associated with larger region of atrialized right ventricle and increased risk of arrhythmic events in Epstein's anomaly. Epstein's anomaly may be associated with right-sided axillary pathway in ventricular pre-excitation, that is WPW syndrome, with or without atrioventricular reentrant tachycardia. Multiple axillary pathways can occur and radiofrequency catheter ablation is effective. Rare cases of ventricular tachycardia with Epstein's anomaly have been reported in literature. One was a case of sustained monomorphic ventricular tachycardia and received an implantable defibrillator. Peritricuspid reentry has been documented in another case of ventricular tachycardia in Epstein's anomaly. Scar formation in the inferior atrialized portion of the right ventricle formed the substrate for the reentrant ventricular tachycardia in this case. Yet another young girl with Epstein's anomaly and ventricular tachycardia received an entirely subcutaneous defibrillator. Tall P waves due to gross right atrial enlargement in Epstein's anomaly has been called Himalayan P waves, though not seen in the ECG illustrated here. Himalayan P waves are also described in tricuspid atresia. Here are some important references for ECG abnormalities discussed in Epstein's anomaly. Discussion on echocardiogram in Epstein's anomaly of tricuspid valve. Parasternal short axis view in Epstein's anomaly showing the dilated right ventricular outflow tract. AO aorta, LA left atrium, RA right atrium. Parasternal long axis view in Epstein's anomaly showing the dilated right ventricular outflow tract. LV left ventricle. Dilated RVOT can be appreciated clinically as a wavy pulsation in the left parasternal region, which is better seen than felt. There is no sustained heave as with left parasternal heave of right ventricular hypertrophy. Dilated RVOT is a feature seen in right ventricular endomyocardial fibrosis as well. In that case, There is no displacement of tricuspid valve. Instead, there is fibrosis of right ventricular apex. Apical four-chamber view in Epstein's anomaly showing the grossly displaced septal tricuspid leaflet. Normal distance between the septal attachments of septal tricuspid leaflet and anterior mitral leaflet is only about 5 millimeters. Apical four-chamber view in Epstein's anomaly showing severe tricuspid regurgitation. Left ventricular systolic and diastolic dysfunction have been reported in Epstein's anomaly of tricuspid valve, presumably due to the left ventricular fibrosis seen in these cases. Left ventricular fibrosis can be due to arterial oxygen desaturation. Left ventricular non-compaction is another potential cause of left ventricular dysfunction in cases in which it is associated. In a study from Mayo Clinic, 50 of the 495 patients who underwent surgery for Epstein's anomaly had moderate or severe left ventricular dysfunction documented on preoperative echocardiogram. Left ventricular function improved in all but 4 of these patients after surgery. There was no deterioration of left ventricular function after surgery in any of the cases. Left ventricular diastolic dysfunction in Epstein's anomaly could be due to right ventricular volume overload, and it can persist even after intracardiac repair. Here are the first set of references on left ventricular dysfunction in Epstein's anomaly. Second set of references on left ventricular dysfunction in Epstein's anomaly of tricuspid valve. Discussion on pregnancy in Epstein's anomaly of the tricuspid valve. Several studies have evaluated the outcome of pregnancy in Epstein's anomaly. Donnelly and colleagues reported on 42 pregnancies in 12 women with Epstein's anomaly. Pregnancy was well tolerated in those who did not have cyanosis or arrhythmia. Though the neonatal outcome was generally good, there was increased risk of prematurity and dysmaturity in babies born to mothers with cyanosis. The authors concluded that maternal cyanosis or arrhythmia were indications for closer maternal and fetal observation. Another study by Connolly and colleagues from Mayo Clinic reported on 111 pregnancies in 44 women with Epstein's anomaly. 89% of the deliveries were vaginal delivery and 11% were cesarean section, and 76% were live births. Birth weight of infants born to cyanotic patients were significantly lower. The study had also checked on the offspring of males with Epstein's anomaly. It was found that 6% of offspring of women with Epstein's anomaly had congenital heart disease, while 1% of offspring of men with Epstein's anomaly had congenital heart disease. This group of authors also concluded that pregnancy is well tolerated in women with Epstein's anomaly. In their study, there were no serious pregnancy-related maternal complications like maternal death, stroke, congestive heart failure, arrhythmia, or endocarditis. While the above two studies were in 1990s, a report from Japan in 2018 included 17 women with Epstein's anomaly who delivered between 1995 to 2015. Delivery was by cesarean section in 8 women, including 9 pregnancies, while 9 women, including 14 pregnancies, underwent vaginal delivery. Elective cesarean section was done in those with significant heart failure or arrhythmias and when 2 or more of the following criteria were present: cardiothoracic ratio 60% or more, moderate or severe tricuspid regurgitation, tricuspid regurgitation jet pressure gradient 35 mm of mercury or more during pregnancy. They found that cardiothoracic ratio and tricuspid regurgitation pressure gradient increased during pregnancy. NYHA functional class deteriorated from class 1 to class 2 or 3 in 5 cases during pregnancy. The authors advised monitoring of clinical and hemodynamic changes throughout pregnancy to minimize maternal cardiac risk and for selection of mode of delivery. Echocardiogram in a patient with Epstein's anomaly and severe tricuspid regurgitation. The mosaic-colored jet is occupying almost the whole of the atrialized right ventricle and right atrium. Another previous report had 13 patients with Epstein's anomaly having 27 pregnancies and 21 live births from 1985 to 2011. 4 of the patients had atrial septal defect and 6 had associated Wolff-Parkinson-White syndrome. 2 patients had undergone closure of AST and 1 had undergone tricuspid valve replacement prior to pregnancy. In 17 pregnancies, patients remained in NYHA class 1 and had full-term vaginal delivery. Cesarean sections were done in 3. 20 of the 21 babies had good neonatal prognosis without congenital heart disease. 1 died due to prematurity. There were 6 spontaneous abortions in this series. Authors concluded that maternal and fetal outcomes were good in patients with Epstein's anomaly and NYHA functional class 1. Tachyarrhythmias and cardiac failure must be looked for in pregnancy. Another smaller study had 8 pregnancies in 4 women with Epstein's anomaly, all resulting in vaginal delivery. 2 babies were delivered prematurely. 1 patient had right heart failure during early pregnancy. Another had arrhythmia during labor, which was managed medically. Another patient had arrhythmia in postpartum period, which was also managed medically. Authors mentioned that when a woman with Epstein's anomaly reaches childbearing age, fertility is not affected even in cyanotic women. They noted that pregnancy outcome is usually favorable under close supervision of obstetrician and cardiologist. In addition to these studies, there are several single case reports of successful pregnancies in women with Epstein's anomaly in literature, though the potential risks mentioned above must be borne in mind. Careful monitoring of maternal and fetal status is needed. Pregnancies in those with cyanosis, arrhythmia, and heart failure carry a higher maternal and fetal risk. Epstein's type of anomaly of left AV valve in corrected transposition. Several patients with congenitally corrected transposition of great arteries have abnormal systemic tricuspid valve, left AV valve. Criteria for Epstein's anomaly may be satisfied in 15 to 50% of cases. It may be associated with severe AV valve regurgitation. EVEREST-2 high-risk study evaluated percutaneous mitral valve repair with Mitra clip device. Mitral valve repair is conventionally the realm of cardiac surgeons. The repair of the mitral valve in cases at high risk of surgery is being done with percutaneously deployed clips. Mitra clip to reduce the severity of mitral regurgitation was evaluated in EVEREST-2 HRS. Safety and utility of this approach, the acute and 1-year results were published initially. Patients enrolled were those deemed high risk for a surgical repair of the mitral valve with an estimated surgical mortality of 12% or more. Of the 78 patients who underwent the Mitra clip procedure, more than half had a previous cardiac surgery and the mean age was 77 years. The 30-day procedure-related mortality was 7.7% versus 8.3% mortality in the comparator group. 1-year survival was 76%, which was significantly better than the 55% survival in the comparator group. 78% of the survivors had grade 2 or less of mitral regurgitation at 1 year. NYHA functional class was also remarkably better from class 3/4 in 89% at baseline to class 1/2 in 74%. Quality of life scores improved and the hospitalizations were reduced. Significant reverse remodeling of the left ventricle was also noted at 1 year. 5-year results of EVEREST-2 showed that even though surgery for residual mitral regurgitation was more often in percutaneous repair at 1 year, the need for surgery between 1 to 5 years was comparable in the two groups. The Mitra clip grasps the mitral leaflet edges and reduces the regurgitation volume and the preload of the left ventricle. In the long run, it reverses adverse left ventricular remodeling and improves clinical outcome. But the results may be poor in those who have long-standing left ventricular volume overload due to severe mitral regurgitation. These persons may have irreversible left ventricular dysfunction and poor prognosis. Hence, it has to be done before irreversible LV dysfunction develops. Here are the first set of important references. Second set of references are here. Discussion on metabolic modulation in heart failure. Most of the treatment strategies in heart failure, like angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors, angiotensin receptor blockers, angiotensin receptor neprilysin inhibitors, and beta blockers, utilize hemodynamic modulation. Metabolic modulation, on the other hand, aims at dealing with myocardial energetic deficiency. Important agents in this group are trimetazidine, ranolazine, and perhexilin. Trimetazidine is a 3-ketoacyl coenzyme A thiolase inhibitor, while ranolazine inhibits the late sodium current. Perhexilin inhibits carnitine palmitoyl transferase. A meta-analysis on trimetazidine published in 2010 found 17 trials including 955 patients. They found that trimetazidine therapy was associated with significant improvement in left ventricular ejection fraction in both ischemic and non-ischemic heart failure. Trimetazidine was shown to have significant protective effects for all-cause mortality, cardiovascular events, and hospitalization. They concluded that large multicentric randomized trials are warranted to clarify the effect of trimetazidine in heart failure. Another meta-analysis published in 2012 had data from 884 patients in 16 randomized controlled trials. They checked the role of additional trimetazidine in patients with chronic heart failure. Hospitalization for cardiac causes, but not all-cause mortality, was reduced by trimetazidine treatment. Trimetazidine therapy was associated with increase in left ventricular ejection fraction, total exercise time, and a decrease in New York Heart Association functional class. In heart failure, there is reduced capacity for fatty acid and carbohydrate oxidation. There is impaired function of the electron transport chain, reduced capacity to transfer ATP, and inefficient energy utilization in heart failure. All these contribute to reduced cardiac energetic status in heart failure. Perhexilin, which was being used as an anti-anginal agent earlier, is now being evaluated for its role in the treatment of heart failure. A study evaluated 50 patients with systolic heart failure in a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial. Perhexilin therapy was associated with 30% increase in the phosphocreatine ATP ratio. This was measured using phosphorus 31 cardiac magnetic resonance spectroscopy. There was also an improvement in the NYHA functional class in this short-term study of 1 month. An open-label study on ranolazine had 41 patients with systolic heart failure and 13 with diastolic heart failure in the study group. Control group had 43 with systolic heart failure and 13 with diastolic heart failure. In the study group, ranolazine was added to guideline-driven therapy. Left ventricular ejection fraction increased in 70% of the study group over a mean follow-up period of 23.7 months. In addition to these three well-known drugs, others have also been evaluated as metabolic modulators in heart failure. Yet we need data from large randomized controlled trials before we can use them on a regular basis in this context. M-mode echocardiogram is short form for time motion mode echocardiography. It was one of the earliest modes of echocardiography. There was also a B mode or brightness mode along with it. Newer modalities like 2D, 3D, Doppler, color Doppler, and tissue Doppler have relegated M mode to limited use in the left ventricular measurements alone. M-mode is a graphical representation of the movements of structures of the heart along a single scan line with time on the x-axis and y-axis showing the distance of the structure from the transducer. Movements can be appreciated as a change in distance from the transducer with time. M-mode is a single-dimensional ice-pick imaging of the heart compared to the two-dimensional echocardiograms, which are easier to interpret. In the earlier era, M-mode transducers did not have 2D facility and it was almost a blind imaging. But now M-mode cuts are guided using 2D images. The location of the M-mode cursor is displayed in a 2D image as an inset. In earlier machines, 2D image was static, while in current machines it keeps on updating at regular intervals, varying on the capacity of the machine software. The usual M-mode sweep is taken from the base of the heart to the apex, but it can be varied according to the convenience of the operator. This image is an M-mode cut at the base showing motion of the aorta, aortic valve and the left atrium. Measurement of left atrium is taken in systole, while that of aorta is taken in diastole. Left atrial dimension is more in systole than in diastole due to the movement of the aorta. Usually, the aortic diameter and left atrial diameter are of similar magnitude, so that when only one is abnormal, we get an idea of left atrial enlargement or aortic root dilatation at one glance. But this does not hold good when both diameters are altered. The open position of the aortic valve has the shape of a parallelogram, while the closed position appears as two parallel lines representing the movement of the right coronary cusp anteriorly and the non-coronary cusp posteriorly. In the fully open position of the valve, the separation of the two leaflets gives an indication of the cardiac output. Poor opening excursion will indicate low cardiac output. Excursion of the aortic valves also give an indication of the cardiac output. Thickened leaflets with poor opening excursion occur in aortic stenosis. Systolic fluttering of the aortic leaflets can be seen when there is subaortic obstruction, which causes a jet to strike the aortic valve from below. In that situation, the valve is pliable and moves well as it is not involved in the disease process. Eccentric aortic valve closure line occurs in bicuspid aortic valve. The 2D image shows the bicuspid aortic valve. M-mode shows the aortic valve closure line marked by yellow arrow is nearer to the anterior aortic wall due to eccentric closure. Eccentricity index for a bicuspid aortic valve is calculated as half of aortic lumen diameter divided by minimum distance of diastolic cusp echo from nearest aortic margin. The diastolic diameter of the aorta is represented by A. Half of it is taken for calculation of eccentricity index. B represents the minimum distance of diastolic cusp echo from nearest aortic margin. Eccentricity index will be near 1 in tri-leaflet valves. It can range from 1.5 to 5.6 with mean of 2.43 in those with bicuspid aortic valves. Reference Naveen C. Nanda and Associates 1974. Left ventricular measurements in M-mode echocardiography are still popular despite advancements in echocardiography. The inset in the upper part of the image shows the 2D image in the parasternal long axis view with the position of the cursor, which is used to get the M-mode cut. LVPWS, left ventricular posterior wall systole, IVSS, interventricular septum systole, LVPWD, left ventricular posterior wall diastole, LVIDD, left ventricular internal diameter diastole, IVSD, interventricular septum diastole, EDV, end diastolic volume. IVS by LVPW, the ratio between the intraventricular septal and posterior wall thickness. The ratio is increased in asymmetric septal hypertrophy in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. The ratio can also be increased when the posterior wall is thinned due to infarction. The ratio is decreased in anterior wall infarction due to thinning of the interventricular septum. IVS percentage of systolic thickening of interventricular septum, ESV and systolic volume, FS fractional shortening, EF ejection fraction, LVPW percentage thickening of left ventricular posterior wall. The difference between end diastolic volume and end systolic volume gives the stroke volume. Stroke volume expressed as a percentage of the end diastolic volume gives the ejection fraction, or the fraction of end diastolic volume ejected out in each systole. Ejection fraction is an important measure of systolic function and has great prognostic significance. Accurate M-mode measurements require good orientation of the cursor perpendicular to the long axis of the left ventricle. If the cursor orientation is oblique, measurements will be overestimated. Availability of anatomical M-mode is useful in such situations. In anatomical M-mode, computer software makes a correction and the cursor can be manually made perpendicular to the long axis of the left ventricle. Another important use of anatomical M-mode is the assessment of regional wall motion. It eliminates limitation due to the subjective nature of wall motion evaluation by 2D echocardiography. Anatomical M-mode cuts can be made in any direction and wall motion abnormalities quantified. In this case, left ventricular systolic function is grossly depressed with a left ventricular ejection fraction of only 31.1%. Usually, the left ventricular cavity is also significantly dilated when there is severe left ventricular dysfunction, but here it is within the normal range. Limitation of ejection fraction measurement by M-mode is that it measures ejection fraction in only one plane and does not represent global left ventricular function. The contractions of anterior and posterior walls alone are represented in this measurement. It gives an erroneous value if there is regional wall motion abnormality of these two walls. Ejection fraction may be overestimated if the basal segments are contracting well while other segments are not contracting so well. Tichold's formula, which is used by echocardiography machine to calculate the ejection fraction, is currently not the best one recommended for clinical use. Two-dimensional and three-dimensional methods are better for assessment of overall left ventricular systolic function. M-mode echocardiogram showing gross left ventricular hypertrophy and moderate to severe left ventricular systolic dysfunction. Both interventricular septum and posterior wall of the left ventricle are grossly thickened. Inset shows short axis view of left ventricle demonstrating severe concentric left ventricular hypertrophy. Left ventricular systolic dysfunction occurs in late stage of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. In the initial stages, there is only left ventricular diastolic dysfunction due to the grossly thickened ventricular myocardium with poor diastolic relaxation. A similar echocardiographic pattern of severe left ventricular hypertrophy with left ventricular systolic dysfunction can also occur when severe aortic stenosis goes in for left ventricular systolic dysfunction and heart failure. Same can occur in coarctation of aorta with heart failure and severe systemic hypertension with left ventricular systolic dysfunction. Thickened left ventricular myocardium with systolic dysfunction can also occur in cardiac amyloidosis. This M-mode cut is through the tip of the mitral valve rather than at the caudal level, which is used for measuring left ventricular dimensions and estimating the ejection fraction. Here the cut has been taken at the tip of the mitral valve to demonstrate other features of left ventricular dysfunction. The topmost echo band below the chest wall represents the movements and thickness of the right ventricular free wall. Downward excursion indicates the systolic contraction of the right ventricular free wall. Echo free space below that represents the right ventricle, usually near the outflow region. Terminating the echo free region of RV is the band of echoes from the interventricular septum. Normally, the septal echoes move downwards towards the left ventricular posterior wall in systole, though the motion is not totally in phase with that of the posterior wall. Here, the amplitude of contractions of the IVS is diminished and pattern is somewhat biphasic. Below the IVS, within the left ventricular cavity, the movement pattern of two leaflets of the mitral valve is visible. C is the systolic closure point of the mitral valve. CD segment represents systole. Some systolic separation between the anterior and posterior mitral leaflets could indicate mitral regurgitation, though this finding is not that specific. The motion of the anterior mitral leaflet is M-shaped, while that of posterior mitral leaflet has a complementary W shape. In systole, both meet and form a single line without any separation in normal case. The amplitude of excursions of PML are less than that of AML, which is also a larger leaflet. When the left ventricular function is normal, the opening excursion DE reaches almost up to the IVS with little separation between the two. The separation is called E-point septal separation EPSS, which is less than 5 mm normally. In this case, the separation is increased due to the left ventricular dysfunction and is over 9.5 mm. E wave occurs during the early diastolic opening of the mitral valve. The nadir of the E wave represents the F point. The EF slope is reduced in mitral stenosis with almost a horizontal EF in severe mitral stenosis. A wave occurs during atrial systole and is absent in atrial fibrillation. Beyond the A wave, a B hum may be visible in cases with left ventricular dysfunction and an elevated left ventricular end diastolic pressure, as in this case. The contractions of the posterior wall are also diminished due to global left ventricular dysfunction, in this case due to doxorubicin-related cardiomyopathy. A mode echocardiogram from another case at the level of the mitral valve showing the early diastolic E wave and the atrial systolic A wave. The left ventricle is dilated and the left ventricular posterior wall contractions are reduced. The distance from the E point of the mitral valve and the interventricular septum is increased due to the poor excursions of the mitral valve on opening and the dilated left ventricle. The overall left ventricular function is reduced and there is regional wall motion abnormality suggestive of coronary artery disease. In this image, the upper image shows the 2D echocardiogram in parasternal long axis view used for guiding the M-mode cut. The cursor is seen to cut the left ventricle at the caudal level just beyond the tip of the mitral leaflets. The motion of the interventricular septum is almost flat due to the anterior wall myocardial infarction. The posterior wall is seen to contract vigorously, partly as compensatory mechanism to improve left ventricular output. Compare the reduced posterior wall contraction in the previous case. A mode echocardiogram showing movements of the interventricular septum and posterior wall of the left ventricle. Right ventricle is seen above the interventricular septum. This is an image from the parasternal view. Right ventricular free wall is adjacent to the chest wall with no echo-free space in between. If there is an echo-free space, that could be either pericardial pad of fat or pericardial effusion. In systole, the posterior wall contracts and moves anteriorly. Normally, the interventricular septum should contract and move towards the posterior wall in systole. Here, the septum moves away from the posterior wall in systole, paradoxical septal motion marked by the pink arrow. This occurs in situations of right ventricular volume overload like atrial septal defect and severe tricuspid regurgitation. Interventricular septum is a common wall shared by the left ventricle and right ventricle. Normally, it contracts with the left ventricle. That is why when it does not contract in synchrony with the left ventricle, it is known as paradoxical septal motion. The paradoxical motion is due to change in the shape of the left ventricle. Normally, the left ventricle is circular in cross-section in both systole and diastole. In right ventricular volume overload, septum becomes flat or even concave towards the right ventricle in diastole. This curvature reverts in systole, producing the paradoxical motion. M-mode echocardiogram in mitral stenosis showing the flat EF slope and paradoxical motion of posterior mitral leaflet. Normally, the anterior mitral leaflet shows an M-shaped anterior movement and posterior mitral leaflet shows a smaller W-shaped posterior movement pattern. The upper panel shows the doming of anterior mitral leaflet in diastole. The doming of the anterior mitral leaflet and the paradoxical anterior motion of the posterior mitral leaflet are the manifestations of commissural fusion seen in rheumatic mitral stenosis. The upper panel also shows a dilated left atrium. Another M-mode echocardiogram in mitral stenosis showing the paradoxical anterior motion of the posterior mitral leaflet in diastole with reduced separation of the two leaflets. Anterior mitral leaflet has various points marked on its movement C, D, E and F. The EF slope is reduced in mitral stenosis. It becomes almost flat in severe mitral stenosis as seen in the previous case. CD is the closed position of mitral leaflets in systole and DE is the opening excursion of the anterior mitral leaflet. A wave and B hump are not seen in this case. A wave during atrial systole gets attenuated in mitral stenosis. B hump occurs only in severe left ventricular dysfunction as seen earlier and inserted in the yellow rectangle here for comparison. Pulmonary hypertension in mitral stenosis as evidenced by the flat EF slope of the pulmonary wall on M-mode echocardiogram and the shallow A wave marked by the arrow. A mid-systolic notch may also appear in severe pulmonary hypertension. When Doppler echo was not available, M-mode of the pulmonary wall was an important tool to assess pulmonary hypertension. Now with Doppler echo, the right ventricular systolic pressure, indirectly the pulmonary artery systolic pressure in the absence of pulmonary stenosis, can be estimated from the velocity of the tricuspid regurgitation jet. Another M-mode echocardiogram of the pulmonary wall showing features of pulmonary hypertension, a flat EF slope and shallow A wave. The A wave in pulmonary wall M-mode echocardiogram becomes shallow in pulmonary hypertension and prominent in pulmonary stenosis. M-mode echocardiogram to assess pulmonary wall was routine in the era when Doppler echo was not available to assess pulmonary hypertension and pulmonary stenosis. Discussion on non-invasive cardiac output monitoring. Conventionally, measurement of cardiac output was done invasively, initially with dye dilution techniques and later on by thermodilution techniques. Both needed pulmonary artery catheterization, which in turn was likely to cause morbidity if used for continuous monitoring. Almost all non-invasive cardiac imaging modalities like echocardiography, computed tomography, magnetic resonance imaging, and nuclear imaging can measure cardiac output, but these are not suitable for bedside monitoring, though echocardiography may be used for intermittent bedside assessment. Assessment of cardiac output, though desirable, was most often time consuming and hence it was replaced by blood pressure monitoring in the intensive care setting. An adequate blood pressure need not mean good tissue perfusion, hence the role of non-invasive cardiac output monitoring. Several technologies with varying accuracy exist for non-invasive or minimally invasive monitoring of cardiac output in the intensive care unit, emergency department, and operation theatre. Some of the methods are pulse wave transit time, non-invasive pulse contour analysis, thoracic electrical bioimpedance, esophageal Doppler, and partial carbon dioxide rebreathing. Though non-invasive monitoring is more convenient, studies have not shown equivalence with invasive monitoring. A meta-analysis by Payton and Associates showed that the percentage error ranged from 41.3% to 44.5%. This was much higher than the acceptable limit of 30%. Bioimpedance method uses a low amplitude, high frequency current passed across the chest and picks up the voltage developed to calculate the impedance. Thoracic impedance decreases when there is more blood in the aorta as blood contains water and iron. Partial carbon dioxide rebreathing technique uses a mask with facial seal. An extra loop of ventilatory circuit creates partial carbon dioxide rebreathing. Cardiac output is calculated using end-tidal carbon dioxide values using Fick's principle. Pulse wave transit time is estimated from the time interval between R wave on the ECG and the peripheral pulse. pulse wave transit time is inversely correlated to the stroke volume. Special algorithms are used to calculate cardiac output from pulse wave transit time. Esophageal Doppler uses velocity time integral of aortic flow and aortic wall cross-section area as in continuity equation to calculate the cardiac output. This measurement is usually not continuous but intermittent. Aortic valve area can be either predetermined or calculated using age and body weight. Each of the techniques used has its own limitations in the intensive care setting with highly variable cardiac output. Most devices have been standardized using measurements in those with near normal cardiac output. The lack of accuracy in comparison with thermodilution technique is a major problem. Even thermodilution technique has its own limitations in the intensive care setting, so that there is no true gold standard for comparison of the other techniques. Discussion on features of prosthetic valves on chest X-ray and fluoroscopy. Approximate positions of the valves as seen on the chest X-ray are marked in the picture. A line connecting the pulmonary bay to the right cardiophrenic angle is used to get the positions of aortic and mitral valves. Mitral valve is below this line while aortic valve is above it. Tricuspid valve is a midline structure, but the actual positions may vary from case to case, especially with differential enlargement of the cardiac chambers. Most commonly replaced valves are the mitral and aortic, tricuspid next, and pulmonary the least. Annuloplasty rings used for valve repair may also be seen on chest X-ray. The older valves were of ball and cage design. The prototype was Starr Edwards valve, which was the workhorse with valves functioning well in a person over 5 decades. But due to other problems, the valve has been discontinued. The design consists of cage with a sewing ring and struts. Mitral valve had 4 struts while the aortic had 3 struts. A ball-shaped poppet moved back and forth during the cardiac cycle to open and close the valve. This image is that of a Starr Edwards prosthetic mitral valve. The valve ring and 4 struts are visible, but the elastic puppet being non-rodeo opaque is not visible. Cage is directed downwards and to the left into the left ventricle for a mitral prosthetic valve. For aortic Starr Edwards valve, there are only 3 struts. Cage is directed upwards and to the right into the aorta for the aortic prosthetic valve. The initial Biot-Shiley valve, which has been discontinued, was a tilting disc valve. Currently, there are single leaflet and bi-leaflet tilting disc valves. TTK Chitra valve is a tilting disc valve with ultra-high molecular weight polyethylene disc which is not radiopaque. The valve ring is visible. This X-ray shows a TTK Chitra valve in aortic position. Here is an X-ray showing TTK Chitra valve in mitral position. Only the valve sewing ring is visible. Though prosthetic valves are seen well on chest X-ray, they can be evaluated better by fluoroscopy. In fluoroscopy, valve leaflets which are radiopaque can be seen opening and closing at the corresponding time of the cardiac cycle depending on the position of the valve. A stuck leaflet can be easily identified. Fluoroscopic view of a bileaflet mitral valve is shown here with leaflets in open position. St. Jude Medical and Carbomedic's bileaflet valves have slightly different characteristics, but both have similar clinical performances. Medtronic Hall is a single leaflet valve. Onyx is a newer bileaflet valve which has been approved for lesser warfarin requirements in aortic position. It shows the opening and closing of the mitral leaflets. This is the ring of the mitral valve, prosthetic mitral valve. The leaflets are seen opening and closing. 2 leaflets are seen in this view. Background shows coronary angiogram. Tiger catheter is seen in the left coronary ostium. This is another view, the RIO caudal view. Earlier one was the LAO caudal view. Here the wall ring is seen in a different plane. You can see the coronary angiogram as well in the background. Discussion on echocardiographic assessment of left ventricular diastolic function with special reference on diastolic function assessment in atrial fibrillation. Though there are several parameters for evaluation of left ventricular diastolic function by echocardiography, the most commonly used are the pulse Doppler mitral E by A ratio and tissue Doppler mitral E by E prime ratio. Some of the other useful parameters are mitral E velocity deceleration time, changes in mitral inflow with Valsalva maneuver, mitral L velocity, isovolumic relaxation time, left atrial maximum volume index, pulmonary vein systolic bar diastolic velocity ratio, mitral color M mode Vp, and E by Vp ratio. Tricuspid regurgitation jet velocity and pulmonary regurgitation end diastolic velocity indicating pulmonary hypertension are also taken as surrogates of left atrial pressure in the absence of pulmonary disease. Doppler interrogation of mitral valve is usually done from the apex through the apical four-chamber view. The transducer is placed directly over the apex beat and the echo beam is directed upwards. A good four-chamber view of the heart is obtained, showing all four chambers and both atrioventricular valves. The Doppler cursor is then aligned along the long axis of the left ventricle, passing through the mitral valve. The Doppler sample volume is placed just distal to the mitral valve so that it picks up the flow in the left ventricular inflow. The initial portion of the mitral diastolic flow is called the E wave, early diastolic, and the final portion which occurs during atrial systole is called the A wave. Normally, most of the left ventricular filling occurs during early diastole and the E wave is taller than the A wave. When the ventricular relaxation is impaired in diastolic dysfunction, the atrial contribution to ventricular filling progressively increases and the A wave height increases so that there is equalization of the E and A waves. As the severity of diastolic dysfunction increases, A wave becomes taller than E wave. This phase is known as E by A reversal. Still further, the E wave becomes taller due to elevated left atrial pressure, mimicking the restrictive filling pattern. This is a type of pseudo-normalization of the mitral flow pattern. The upper half of the image shows the apical four-chamber view of the heart. The Doppler cursor and the sample volume are seen along midline of the left ventricle. The lower half of the image shows the Doppler flow pattern across the mitral valve. The x-axis is time and y-axis represents the velocity in centimeters per second. A triphasic left ventricular filling pattern with an additional mid-diastolic wave called T wave by some authors and L wave by others can occur in situations of left ventricular diastolic dysfunction, especially in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Another video on this channel describes triphasic mitral flow in more detail. The normal ratio between the amplitudes of E and A waves, E by A ratio, is 0.75 to 1.5. The mitral flow Doppler patterns in left ventricular diastolic dysfunction has been divided into 4 stages. Stage 1. In mild diastolic dysfunction, E by A ratio is reversed and less than 0.75. The reversal is due to the increase in A wave due to the more forceful atrial contraction to overcome left ventricular diastolic dysfunction. The deceleration time of the early diastolic filling or DT is normally less than 220 milliseconds. DT is prolonged in diastolic dysfunction. These patients are generally asymptomatic. In stage 2 diastolic dysfunction, the E wave becomes taller due to elevated left atrial pressure. This is called pseudo-normalization of the filling pattern. In this stage, E by A reversal can still be demonstrated during Valsalva maneuver. In stage 2 diastolic dysfunction, the E wave becomes very high so that E by A ratio is more than 1.5 and the dt is below 150 milliseconds. This is also called restrictive filling pattern. In stage 4, this restrictive filling pattern remains fixed even during Valsalva maneuver. Initial stages 1 to 3 are considered reversible with treatment. Stage 4 is considered as advanced. Use of drugs producing bradycardia like beta blockers in stages 3 and 4 may precipitate low output state. Tissue Doppler image with color kinases in the inset. E by E prime of the medial mitral annulus is shown as 19.1, indicating type 2 left ventricular diastolic dysfunction. In diastolic dysfunction, as the relaxation of the ventricle is impaired, the velocity of medial mitral annulus is reduced so that the E by E prime ratio is increased. E wave is measured prior to tissue Doppler imaging and stored so that the software application displays the E by E prime as soon as the E prime is measured. E by E prime below 8 is considered normal, while ratio above 15 is considered a feature of left ventricular diastolic dysfunction. E by E prime has been correlated with left atrial pressure as well, which is in fact the left ventricular filling pressure, which increases in left ventricular diastolic dysfunction. Estimation of pulmonary capillary wedge pressure from E by E prime on tissue Doppler was covered in another video on this channel. The E velocity at the lateral mitral annulus is different from that at the septal mitral annulus. Septal E prime is slightly lower than lateral E prime. E by E prime at lateral mitral annulus more than 10 and E by E prime at septal mitral annulus more than 15 indicates left ventricular diastolic dysfunction. The yellow tracing is pulsed wave tissue Doppler imaging. The next negative wave after E prime occurs during atrial contraction and is designated AA. The positive wave after AA is the SA wave, representing the systolic myocardial wave recorded as the annulus descends towards the apex. E prime velocity is also known as EA, A for annulus, or EM, M for myocardial velocity. It reflects the early myocardial relaxation and occurs during the ascent of the mitral annulus. Measurement of E prime is useful in differentiation of pseudonormalization in the mitral inflow from the normal pattern. There are also limitations for E by E prime in the assessment of LV diastolic dysfunction. One situation is decompensated advanced systolic heart failure with large left ventricle. Broad QRS with abnormal septal motion, significant mitral regurgitation, and presence of cardiac resynchronization therapy are all confounding factors. Usually, LV diastolic dysfunction assessment by echo relies on mitral inflow velocity measurement with demonstration of E by A reversal as an evidence of diastolic dysfunction. In atrial fibrillation, the absence of atrial contraction and the A wave makes this assessment impossible. Moreover, the variation in the cardiac cycle also causes beat-to-beat changes in ventricular relaxation. Echo parameters useful in the presence of AF include mitral E wave dt and E by E prime, color mode derived VP, early diastolic flow propagation velocity, and E by VP, peak pulmonary vein diastolic flow velocity, pulmonary vein diastolic wave dt, peak acceleration of the mitral E wave, IVRT, and ratio of IVRT to the time between onsets of E and E prime waves. Flow propagation velocity VP on color M mode is measured as the slope of the first color aliasing velocity from the mitral annulus in early diastole to 4 cm distally into the left ventricular cavity. A dual Doppler technique has been described for simultaneous measurement of E and E prime so that the ratio E by E prime can be calculated in the same beat itself. This avoids the beat-to-beat variation in these values, which would compound a non-simultaneous measurement. Short of this novel technique, Any measurement in AF would need averaging of values for 5 to 10 cardiac cycles. Mitral E wave dt less than 100 milliseconds correlates with a pulmonary wedge pressure of more than 18 millimeters of mercury. Deceleration time is the duration between the peak of the E wave and the upper deceleration slope extrapolated to the baseline. It is usually measured from the apical four-chamber view. Pulmonary vein diastolic wave dt is also measured in a similar way from the right upper pulmonary vein in the apical four-chamber view. Discussion on intra-aortic balloon pump and IABP shock 2 trial. Intra-aortic balloon pump or intra-aortic balloon counterpulsation is used to augment the cardiac output and reduce the afterload to the left ventricle. Classic indication for IABP was cardiogenic shock. It can be either in the setting of acute myocardial infarction, cardiac surgery, or in a person undergoing high-risk percutaneous coronary intervention. The balloon is inserted through the femoral artery and the balloon positioned below the left subclavian and above the renal arteries. Aortic disease and aortic regurgitation are contraindications for balloon pump insertion. The balloon is inflated in diastole and collapses in systole. Helium is used to rapidly inflate and deflate the balloon synchronized to the cardiac cycle. Synchronization can be done using either the ECG signal or pressure transducer signal. There is a small risk of paraplegia due to injury to main thoracic intercostal vessels supplying the spinal cord. IABP is the classic condition in which diastolic pressure is higher than the systolic pressure in a pressure tracing. Cardiac monitor screenshot while on IABP. Green tracing ECG. White tracing respiration. Red tracing intraarterial blood pressure. Yellow tracing pulse oximetry. Displays on right side from top to bottom. Heart rate, respiratory rate, blood pressure, oxygen saturation or SpO2. It can be seen that the pressure wave in systole is very small. Yellow marker is placed over the R wave in ECG. Small pressure wave just after that is systolic and the one after that diastolic augmentation by IABP. Pressure tracing and ECG while on IABP. The upper channel shows ECG and the lower channel shows the arterial pressure tracing. It can be clearly seen that the diastolic pressure after the T wave on the ECG is much higher than the systolic pressure. This is because the intra-aortic balloon is inflated in diastole and deflated in systole. Inflation of the balloon in diastole enhances the coronary perfusion. Screenshot of the IABP screen. The uppermost green tracing is the electrocardiogram, which is used to time the inflation and deflation of the balloon. The augmentation time is marked just below the tracing to indicate the exact point of inflation and deflation. The arterial pressure tracing just below that indicates the diastolic augmentation. The figure on the top in green color, 130, indicates the heart rate. The figures below that are the peak, trough and mean pressures from the arterial line. Augmentation level and alarm limit for the augmentation are the lower figures. The filling level of the helium tank is also indicated. The diagram of the graduated balloon will show the filling in real time by the flickering of light on and off. Helium is used for filling the balloon because it is the lightest inert gas which can move in and out rapidly according to the cardiac cycle. Balloon inflation and deflation can be triggered either by the ECG or by the pressure tracing. In auto mode, the choice is done by the circuitry automatically. Here the augmentation ratio is 1:1, meaning that all cycles receive augmentation. It can be reduced while weaning off, like augmentation of alternate cycles or lower. In IABP shock 2 trial, IABP did not reduce 30-day mortality compared to control. This resulted in international guideline recommendation for IABP use in cardiogenic shock complicating acute myocardial infarction to be downgraded. The trial randomized 600 patients with cardiogenic shock complicating acute myocardial infarction who were undergoing early revascularization to either IABP or control. At 12-month follow-up, 52% in the IABP group and 51% in the control group had died. There were no significant differences in reinfarction, recurrent revascularization, or stroke. Quality of life measures among the survivors also did not differ significantly between the groups. 6-year follow-up data also did not show any mortality benefit for those who were randomly assigned to receive IABP support. But mortality was very high, with 2/3 of patients with cardiogenic shock dying even with revascularization and optimal medical therapy. Routine placement of IABP for cardiogenic shock is a Class 3 recommendation as per the 2017 European Society of Cardiology guidelines for ST elevation myocardial infarction. Discussion on left ventricular reverse remodeling. Left ventricular remodeling, which starts initially as a beneficial process, becomes detrimental later on, leading to progressive worsening of left ventricular dilatation and dysfunction. Reverse left ventricular remodeling is a beneficial process which occurs after optimal medical therapy or cardiac resynchronization therapy in heart failure. Similar reverse remodeling has been described after valve replacement and repair procedures. Yu and colleagues studied reverse left ventricular remodeling in 141 patients with advanced heart failure who received cardiac resynchronization therapy and was followed up for a mean period of 695 days. There were 22 deaths in the study period, mostly due to heart failure and sudden cardiac death. They checked the relation between the reduction of left ventricular and systolic volume at 3 to 6 months and long-term clinical outcome. They found that a reduction of left ventricular and systolic volume of 9.5% or more had a sensitivity of 70% and specificity of 70% for predicting all-cause mortality. Corresponding figures for cardiovascular mortality were 87% and 69% respectively. This cutoff value identified 61.7% as responders to reverse remodeling. All-cause mortality was significantly lower in responders, 6.9% versus 30.6%. Cardiovascular mortality was 2.3% in responders compared to 24.1% in non-responders. Heart failure events were 11.5% in responders and 33.3% in non-responders. In this study, change in left ventricular and systolic volume was the single most important predictor of all-cause mortality and cardiovascular mortality. Clinical parameters could not predict outcome events in this study. Similar beneficial effect on LV remodeling was demonstrated long back in the trials with angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors. Studies of left ventricular dysfunction trial showed that in patients with heart failure and reduced LV ejection fraction, chronic treatment with angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitor enalapril prevented progressive LV dilatation, systolic dysfunction, and increase in end-systolic volume. Mean end-systolic volume decreased from 106 to 93 ml per meter squared in the study group, while it increased from 103 to 116 ml per meter squared in the control group. Survival and ventricular enlargement trial with captopril showed that LV end-diastolic and end-systolic areas at 1 year were larger in placebo group than in captopril group. They noted that LV enlargement and dysfunction after myocardial infarction were associated with the development of adverse cardiac events. Preventing ventricular enlargement with captopril was associated with a reduction in adverse events. LV reverse remodeling after CRT with more than 20% reduction in LV and systolic volume is considered to be much larger than that observed in medical therapy for heart failure. Generally, about one-third of patients do not respond well to CRT. Lack of clinical response and absence of LV reverse remodeling has been included in the definition of non-responders to CRT. A discord between those with and without left bundle branch block has been reported in a sub-study of MADIT CRT. Authors compared patients with CRT alone and those with CRT and defibrillator who had echocardiograms available at 1 year. Patients in the sub-study were stratified by the presence or absence of LBBB. In those with LBBB on CRT-D, a median reduction in LV and systolic volume of more than 35% significantly reduced the risk of long-term mortality and heart failure events compared to patients with ICDs alone. In patients without LBBB, there was no survival benefit despite a reduction of LV and systolic volume more than the median 27.6%. Those with LBBB and least reverse remodeling had more than threefold risk for death compared with those with ICDs only. Authors concluded that despite LV reverse remodeling with CRT-D, there was no survival benefit and potential harm in patients without LBBB. Left ventricular reverse remodeling in patients with idiopathic dilated cardiomyopathy on medical therapy has been reported in a study of 361 patients. They defined LV reverse remodeling as increase of LV ejection fraction more than or equal to 10 units or a LV ejection fraction more than or equal to 50% and a decrease in indexed LV end diastolic diameter of more than or equal to 10% or indexed LV end diastolic diameter of more than or equal to 33 mm per meter squared. LV reverse remodeling was noted in 37% of the patients surviving 2 years. LV reverse remodeling on tailored medical therapy at midterm follow-up predicted a lower rate of major cardiovascular events on long-term follow-up. Mean follow-up period was 110 months for the surviving patients after the midterm follow-up at 24 months. LV reverse remodeling has been documented in patients with severe aortic regurgitation undergoing aortic valve replacement. They defined reverse remodeling of LV as more than or equal to 10% reduction in measures of LV volumes. They noted that LV reverse remodeling as assessed by the Tichols method was underestimated by a mean of 31 ml per meter squared compared to Simpson method. Echocardiographic parameters indicating reverse LV remodeling at 1 year after aortic valve replacement are important predictors of long-term outcomes after aortic valve replacement. LV reverse remodeling was associated with significantly reduced event rate at 2 years after mid-tract procedure for mitral regurgitation. In that study, LV reverse remodeling was defined as more than or equal to 10% of the LV end diastolic diameter after 12 months. This was noted in 49% of the patients. The study included both degenerative mitral regurgitation and functional mitral regurgitation. In degenerative mitral regurgitation, presence of recurrent or residual severe mitral regurgitation at 12 months inversely predicted LV reverse remodeling. In functional MR, residual severe tricuspid regurgitation inversely predicted LV reverse remodeling. Discussion on renal denervation for hypertension and Symplicity HTN-3 and Spiral HTN off-med trials. Renal denervation for hypertension, initially thought to be a promising procedure, went into disrepute after the publication of the Symplicity HTN-3 trial. But the procedure has staged a potential comeback after this publication of Spiral HTN OFF-MED trial. Simplicity HTN-3 was a prospective, single-blind, randomized, sham-controlled trial of patients with severe resistant hypertension. Patients were receiving a stable antihypertensive regimen of maximally tolerated doses of at least 3 antihypertensive medications, including a diuretic. Primary efficacy endpoint was change in office blood pressure at 6 months. The study randomized 555 patients in a 2:1 ratio to renal denervation or sham procedure. Patients were required to have a systolic blood pressure of 160 millimeters of mercury or more as an average of 3 measurements. Radiofrequency energy was delivered using Simplicity renal denervation catheter. Patients were unaware of whether it was a renal artery denervation or sham procedure. Blood pressure was assessed by persons unaware of the randomization. A composite of major adverse events was taken as the primary safety endpoint. The events were all-cause mortality, end-stage renal disease, an embolic event resulting in end-organ damage, renal artery or other vascular complications, hypertensive crisis within 30 days, or new renal artery stenosis of more than 70% within 6 months. The blinded Simplicity HTN-3 trial did not show significant reduction of systolic blood pressure in patients with resistant hypertension after 6 months of renal artery denervation as compared to a sham control. There were no significant differences in safety between active treatment and sham control groups. The results of Simplicity HTN-3 trial were in contradiction to that of unblinded Simplicity HTN-2 trial. In the Simplicity HTN-2 trial, those with immediate renal denervation had a mean fall of 31.7 millimeters of mercury at 6 months and 28.1 millimeters of mercury at 1 year. Those who crossed over to renal denervation from control group had a mean fall of 23.7 millimeters of mercury at 6 months after the procedure. Enrollment criteria for Simplicity HTN-2 were similar to Simplicity HTN-3 trial, but it was unblinded and had a lower number of patients of 106 only. Spiral HTN OFF-MED was a proof of concept trial evaluating the effect of renal denervation on blood pressure in the absence of medications. It was a multi-center, international, single-blind, randomized, sham-controlled trial. Office systolic blood pressure was between 150 to 180 millimeters of mercury, diastolic blood pressure 90 millimeters of mercury or more. 24-hour ambulatory systolic blood pressure was between 140 to 170 millimeters of mercury at screening. The patients underwent renal angiography and were assigned to renal denervation or sham control. Primary endpoint was change in 24-hour blood pressure at 3 months. Drug surveillance was done to ensure absence of antihypertensive medication. The trial had a total of 80 patients. A fall of 24-hour systolic blood pressure of 5.5 millimeters of mercury and diastolic blood pressure of 4.8 millimeters of mercury was documented in the renal denervation group compared to the sham control group. Corresponding values for office blood pressure was 10 millimeters of mercury and 5.3 millimeters of mercury. These results were statistically highly significant. Thus, the authors claim to have established the biological proof of principle for blood pressure lowering efficacy of renal denervation. Spiral HTN OFF-MED pivotal study randomized 331 hypertensive patients to either renal denervation or sham procedure. Office blood pressure was between 150 to 180 millimeters of mercury. 24-hour systolic blood pressure was lowered by 3.9 millimeters of mercury and office systolic blood pressure by 6.5 millimeters of mercury. There was no device-related or procedure-related safety events up to 3 months. The authors concluded that Spiral Pivotal documented the superiority of catheter-based renal denervation to safely lower blood pressure in the absence of antihypertensive medications.